Emmeline always felt safe and secure in her neighborhood. She lived in a small town where everyone knew each other, and strangers were a rare sight. Every night before bed, she would check the locks on her doors. But last night, for some reason, she forgot. Exhausted from a long day, she walked right past the door without thinking about her usual routine and went to bed. As Emmeline closed her eyes, a strange sense of unease washed over her, though she told herself it was just stress from a work project. She started to drift off, and the house settled into silence. An hour later, she suddenly jolted awake. Something felt different in the house. A heavy darkness cloaked her bedroom, but there was a strange sensation, a presence. Nothing's wrong, it's just your imagination, she told herself. But as she looked closer into the darkness, she noticed a faint smell, a strange metallic odor like rusty iron. She shivered, feeling a wave of cold run through her body. Almost without realizing what she was doing, she pulled the blanket up to her chin and listened. Somewhere downstairs, she heard a quiet creak. Her heart began to pound. Emmeline was sure she heard footsteps downstairs. Had she forgotten to lock the door? Trying not to make any sudden movements, she reached for her phone on the nightstand and checked the screen. It was 3:15 a.m. The time alone felt ominous. Just go check and make sure everything's fine, she told herself. But something inside her resisted. A voice in her head screamed that she should stay in her room. Cautiously, she stood up, trying not to make a sound, and approached her bedroom door. Downstairs, something creaked again. This time, she heard distinct footsteps, moving closer. Emmeline froze, straining to listen, and suddenly realized that the footsteps had stopped. The abrupt silence weighed heavily on her ears. She stood at the door, battling the urge to peek downstairs. Her instincts told her something was very wrong. But before she could take any action, she heard a sound. It wasn't just a creak. Someone had begun to tap softly, almost playfully, against the wall. Tap, tap, tap. Emmeline felt her panic rise, constricting her lungs. Whatever it was, it didn't seem afraid of being discovered. Someone or something was in her house and was trying to get her attention. For a moment, she closed her eyes, convincing herself it was just her imagination. Then the tapping moved to the staircase. She heard the old steps creak as someone or something began to climb them, coming closer to her room. Emmeline swallowed, her hand trembling as she reached for the lock on her bedroom door and turned the key. The door made a barely audible click, but it was enough. The footsteps stopped again. It was as if her guest knew she was hiding there, just behind the door. Seconds stretched on in silence. Emmeline held her breath, listening to the stillness, but one thought echoed in her mind. Who came into my house? Why are they here? Time passed, and she began to think it was just a dream, some strange vision. But just as she started to relax, she heard a barely audible whisper from behind the door. You forgot to lock the door, didn't you? Said a voice, cold and dark. Her heart stopped, but the voice continued, now even closer. I come for those who forget to lock their doors at night. Emmeline felt panic swell within her, and she pressed herself against the door, holding it shut with all her strength. But the voice only let out a quiet, mocking laugh. A creak. The footsteps began to move away, descending the stairs until, finally, they disappeared into the distance. In the silence that followed, Emmeline could hardly believe it was over. She didn't sleep a wink until dawn, sitting in terror until the first rays of sunlight filled her room. Only then did she dare to look outside her bedroom and go downstairs. The front door was slightly ajar. Emmeline carefully made her way downstairs, her feet barely touching the floor. The first rays of sun were streaming through the windows, but even their warmth couldn't dispel her horror. The open front door creaked ominously as she approached it, and her heart clenched. She was sure she hadn't locked it before bed. But the door wasn't the only thing that caught her attention. On the floor, across the light-colored carpet by the entryway, she saw dark footprints, bare, wet, and muddy. They led from the threshold, trailing through the living room, and disappeared somewhere near the stairs. Emmeline slowly followed the trail, her mind racing. Every detail of the room felt unusual, as if the house had stopped being her own. Everything seemed changed, as if someone had left not only a physical mark, but also an eerie presence in the atmosphere of her home. When she reached the stairs, she noticed the footprints faded out on the last step, then vanished entirely. She was trembling, unsure of what to do, but her fear was gradually giving way to curiosity. Who or what had left these tracks? And why had this stranger or thing simply left without harming her? Several days passed, but Emmeline couldn't forget that night. She double-checked the doors and windows, making sure to lock them several times over. Yet the feeling of dread didn't leave her. Every evening, as darkness settled over the town, she felt as if someone was watching her. Whenever she sat in silence, she could hear that whisper replaying in her mind. One night, as she was sitting on the couch watching TV, her gaze fell upon her reflection in the window. At first, she didn't notice anything unusual, but then her blood ran cold. Behind her, in the corner of the room, was a dark figure, barely visible, like a shadow, but distinct enough for Emmeline to feel that it was studying her. Its gaze was unblinking and cold, as if the stranger found satisfaction in watching her fear. She whipped around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. Emmeline let out a nervous laugh, convincing herself it was just exhaustion and paranoia playing tricks on her. But when she turned back to the window, she saw the figure again. This time, the shadow was closer, as if the stranger from another realm was slowly inching toward her through the reflection. Night after night, Emmeline felt more isolated, as if her home had become a trap. She almost stopped sleeping, constantly listening for the faintest sounds. In desperation, she began researching whether there were any stories about what happened to those who forgot to lock their doors at night. Her search led her to a strange, ancient legend. She found mentions of an entity known as the Midnight Watcher's Shadow, a spirit that supposedly came to those who left their doors open during the dark hours. The legend claimed that the shadow didn't come to kill, but to watch. At first, it would appear as a vague figure, but if the person continued to ignore its presence, the shadow would begin to haunt them, moving deeper into their home and mind until it consumed their soul entirely. Emmeline felt paralyzed with fear. She realized that she had left the door unlocked only once that week, and that was enough to summon something that had come to her house like a nocturnal guest who wouldn't leave until it had taken its due. With each passing day, Emmeline felt the shadow growing closer, something inevitable and terrifying. On yet another evening, she saw its reflection in the window again, but this time the shadow stood in the hallway, right at her bedroom threshold. Its eyes were empty, black as the night itself, but there was something alive in them, as though the shadow was savoring her fear. In a panic, Emmeline ran to the front door, not even thinking about what she was doing. She grabbed the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. The lock seemed fused to the doorframe, as though the entire house had become her prison. And then she heard a whisper right by her ear. "You forgot to lock the door again. I'm here because you invited me." Emmeline tried to scream, but no sound came out. In despair, she turned to see the shadow moving slowly toward her, as if her own fear was a magnet, pulling this entity closer. The last thing Emmeline saw before darkness enveloped her completely was the silhouette of the shadow reaching out its hands toward her. Her vision began to fade, and she realized that somewhere deep within this entity lay an ancient, malevolent hunger she couldn't understand. And her home, once a safe haven, had forever become a place where doors had been opened to an invisible horror she had unwittingly let inside. When her friends grew concerned about her absence a few days later, they found her house locked from the inside but empty. The only eerie detail they noticed was a faint shadow on the window, almost like eyes watching the outside world.